piece of tallit potentially in his hand, right? This small piece of the bottom of the robe in his hand, and the rest is still on Samuel. Okay. So in a way, it symbolizes how Saul forcefully went after and tried to grab. Think about this. Saul, in the same way, forcefully went after David and tried to grab and harm David to try and keep the word of the Lord from coming to pass and to try to stop the word of the Lord from being fulfilled about another being anointed king. So that little piece of tallit Saul may have had in his hand when the garment tore may have represented A, the amount of time he had left, which was very little, and B, that is about how much power you have left right now, Saul. About this much, this little bit of fabric. That's about how much power you have left. The rest walked away with Samuel. The rest of God's anointed, it all walked away with Samuel. You see what I mean? The tallit represents a covering. It's a holy covering, right? The physical tearing of that holy covering was a manifestation in the natural of the Lord ripping up that mantle, tearing that mantle, and covering over Saul in the realm of the spirit. Isn't it interesting that also the curtains, right? It was the long curtains to the holies of holies. When Jesus said it is finished, it tore. God tore it, right? It was torn away. It was opened up to the people. No more would the priests have to go in there in secret. So that's interesting. But back to Saul. So there's now a physical manifestation of what has been torn away from Saul in the spirit. God has already made the decision in the spirit, but Saul still remains king. So the decision's been made in the spirit. However, Saul's not removed, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. One of the first things mentioned is that Saul built a monument to himself. Not to God, but to himself. Now, before I go into this, okay, the Biden presidency is the second part or the last part of Saul's reign, the last part of his reign. So when the anointing leaves Saul and the covering departs from Saul and he's left with torment and anger and even mental illness, it was short-lived, however. But that is when Saul was at his most dangerous. That's when he was at his most destructive. That's when he was trying to do the most harm. That's when he's trying to divide the kingdom. That's when all these things happened, was then. So you see, the same progression with the Biden presidency is happening. And we are at that point now that Saul was at when the kingdom was completely torn from him. But Saul was not removed that day. So the kingdom is torn away from Saul. He's not removed that day, though. He remains king for a short period. It's because, well, the Lord decided it the day the tallit tore. That day that tallit tore, that robe tore, it was decided. Now he had to get David ready to assume the throne. So basically, Saul, for a bit, remains in the office of king. However, he already in the realm of the spirit was removed. Does that make sense? He's in the office still, but in the realm of the spirit, he's already been removed. God has already decided it, and now the natural would have to catch up to God's decision. So now the natural has to catch up, and David's got to come up to bring into alignment in the natural what God has already decided in the spiritual. So this is the point. It all fairly quickly goes downhill for Saul. It goes downhill for him. Interestingly enough, and I'm going to tell you this because there is a debate about how long Saul's reign was, actually. The length of Saul's reign, now think about this because this is a little wild. The length of Saul's reign is uncertain since a number is missing in the Hebrew text. which simply says he reigned ... and 2 years. Okay? Most scholars would say he ruled about 22 years. And if one takes the biblical evidence, 12 years might be the conclusion drawn, because the ark was captured by the Philistines sometime before Saul began to reign. According to 1 Samuel 7:2, it was kept in Kiriath Jearim some 20 years. It was taken to Jerusalem in the early part of David's reign in 2 Samuel 6, verses 1 through 15. But David reigned for over 7 years at Hebron before Jerusalem was captured in 2 Samuel 5:5. If this 20 years is to be taken literally, or even as meaning around 20 years, it would seem to limit Saul's reign to no more than 12 years. So if you begin to do the math of where the ark was moving around, okay, and how long it was there, and when David moved the ark, and what went on, you may get the conclusion that Saul's reign was 12 years. Now, this theory is interesting because 12 has to do with government rule and divine rule. So that, in a way, would kind of match first king becomes corrupt. Within 12 years, he's removed. Now, why is this the last part of the Saul reign? This kind of matches up to what's happened. So let me just entertain me for a minute here. Obama was in 8 years. Now you have Biden, who is supposed to serve a 4-year term. That would equal 12 years. That would equal the reign of Saul. I don't think that is a coincidence. I don't think that's a coincidence at all, that it lines up that way. Now, I'm going to tell you something else, an interesting side note before we go on here. Saul's disobedience contributed to the attempt to, at a future date, exterminate the Jews. Now, how did this happen? Saul spared the Amalekite king. Remember, he spares the Amalekite king. He doesn't do what God says. Before the next day, when I believe it was Samuel who executes the Amalekite king and carries it out, the Amalekite king assaults and impregnates a Jewish maidservant. Haman in the book of Esther came from that line of the Amalekites that Saul in his disobedience let continue. So you see, Saul's sin was so egregious because the Lord already saw in the future what it would bring about, which would be Haman would come from that line and attempt to exterminate the Jews. This is why the Lord wanted the Amalekites destroyed, because he saw what was coming up the line. He saw exactly what was coming up the line. But it's interesting to mention, nonetheless, that there was a reason here when God saw ahead that this was going to become so problematic. Okay, now back to Saul. We're going back to Saul now, like where we're going with this. So isn't it interesting that in the New Testament, Acts chapter 8, this is another interesting side note here. Paul was initially Saul, a Pharisee, a ruling class who persecuted believers who were trying to go forth and do the work of the Lord. And that, in this case, we have Saul, a ruling king, attempting to persecute a shepherd named David, who is trying to go forth and do the work of the Lord. Interesting, the parallels, isn't it? What Saul the Pharisee did, why Saul the Pharisee wanted to harm Christians, and why Saul the king did what he did, and why Saul the king was harming priests, right? So Saul had priests killed. He tried to kill David. It parallels to the New Testament in the book of Acts. I'll tell you exactly where it is, actually. Acts chapter 8 is the account where Saul is persecuting believers, and then the road to Damascus happens, and Paul is knocked off his donkey, and he undergoes this radical transformation. But it parallels. You got two Sauls who are both ruling class, who are persecuting priests and shepherds and those trying to do the work of the Lord to keep power. So that's a nice little parallel there between the two. Okay, now we're really getting back to on track here to Saul the King. I just thought those two side notes are interesting to add to what's already going on here. We have to understand too, the enemy is using Saul to try to kill David because Jesus, Yeshua, is supposed to be birthed through the line of David. So the enemy is using Saul as a pawn to ensure that Jesus can't come through this line, to try to totally disrupt that seed, that line. And that's why Saul relentlessly pursued David. He became a vessel for the enemy at his point of mental, physical, and spiritual deterioration. He became nothing but a vessel for the enemy to fill with wickedness and malice. And we're going to get into malice and a spirit of malice and what it really means. To fill Saul with that, to kill David, to ultimately try to disrupt the seed of Jesus from being born. Now, after the Lord tells Samuel, he regrets setting up Saul as king. The Lord says to Samuel that he regrets making Saul king. But the first mention is not what Saul did with the Amalekites. The first mention here is that Saul set up a monument for himself and passed by it. That is the first mention. That is mentioned before, we'll call it Amalekite Gate, takes place. It's this first. So after reading this, I was prompted to search for monuments of Biden. I'm like, because if this lines up, because you have to understand the enemy works in cycles. The enemy works cyclically, okay? So I'm looking up to see, okay, is there a pattern being followed here? So after reading this, I'm prompted to search for monuments of Biden. And I'm going to read you the article because you can't make this stuff up, people. You just can't. This article is from July of 2021. It's from Euractiv. So EURACTIV. I believe it is a European website that reports European news. July 7th, 2021. In the town of Eurosevach, near the U.S. military base Bonsteel, work has begun on a site set to host a statue of U.S. President Joe Biden. The statue, which cost 600,000 euro, is a sign of gratitude for the U.S. support in consolidating Kosovo's peace and independence, according to an official statement from the city council. This is not the first time Kosovo has shown its gratitude to the U.S. In 2019, on the occasion of the 20th anniversary of the entry of NATO forces into Kosovo, the bust of Madeleine Albright, former U.S. Secretary of State during NATO campaign in former Yugoslavia, was unveiled. So meaning that the sculpted head of Madeleine Albright they were talking about. There is also a statue of former President Bill Clinton. An avenue in Pristina is named after former U.S. President George W. Bush, and a street is named after Wesley Clark, the 1999 NATO military commander. So, why is this important? Why does this mean anything? Well, we're going to try to get this straight here. Kosovo, where this statue is being unveiled, is the place where the Yugoslav wars happened. The Kosovo War was an armed conflict in Kosovo that started the 28th of February 1998 and lasted until the 11th of June 1999. It was part of the Yugoslav Wars. The Yugoslav Wars were a series of separate but related ethnic conflicts, wars of independence, and insurgencies fought in the former Yugoslavia from 1991 to 2001, leading up to and resulting from the breakup of the Yugoslav Federation in 1992. Its constituent republics declared independence due to unresolved tensions between ethnic minorities in the new countries, which fueled the wars. Now, a statue of Biden is being unveiled in the place where the Yugoslav wars happened. Why is this so significant? This is the monument, okay? Within this progression of what happened with Saul, this is the monument, okay? The unveiling of the monument, but they had a playbook in Yugoslavia to bring about this civil war, okay? And this ethnic cleansing. There was a communist playbook. I'm going to read to you what this playbook entails. And it's going to begin to make more sense prophetically why a statue of this man would be put there, and why a statue, by the way, of Clinton and George W. Bush. Don't you find it amazing that he was the president when 9/11 happened, and the year the Yugoslav wars end, 9/11 occurs here? Do you find that to be a little weird? The year these wars end, 2001, boom, 9/11 hits here, and thus begins their plan to section off, divide, and break down the nation. Now I'm going to read to you the playbook, and this is going to start to make a lot more sense prophetically why this is going on. I'm going to read to you 13 steps here, okay? 1, rebrand communism into National Socialism, which was initially tested in Nazi Germany, okay? This is the playbook. 2, divide people into groups, create tribal or groupthink to create these levels of hatred that lead to genocide. 3, make social policies that lead to countless individual disadvantages. When this becomes obvious, you claim discrimination and hatred of one group towards another. Then the screaming begins that those inequalities must be corrected by favoring the oppressed, discriminated group. 4, next, enter national quotas for hiring. What national quotas do you know of right now are happening for hiring? What national mandates are happening right now for hiring? Okay. 5, have the media fuel the fire and cause fear to run rampant in insecurity, thus destroying relationships, marriages, and creating a great air of mistrust. 6, people then start retreating and isolating into their own groups because they don't feel safe anymore with the individuals from the other group. Does this all sound familiar? 7, staged and well-organized mass protests begin all over the country. Now you need a spark to ignite violence as the protests start peacefully. 8, enter multiple claim murders of one group by another. There's the spark. 9, the tipping point. People start erecting barricades in their towns, highways, and roads guarded by armed civilians. 10, law enforcement trying to remove the barricades would be ambushed and killed. 11, mass media shows the horrifying violence in headlines. 12, army is deployed to restore order, except they were confused about who was the perpetrator and who was the victim, because there were perpetrators and victims on both sides. 13, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and the moving of hundreds of thousands of people from one group to certain designated areas. If that does not sound familiar. This is the playbook they used in this whole mess with Yugoslavia and Kosovo and the Yugoslav wars. This was it. What I just read to you, tell me that does not sound familiar to what is happening right now. Because it's the same playbook. They've just put a new cover on it. It's the same playbook, different cover. Okay? Now, isn't it interesting? Like I said, the year the war ends, this war, 9/11 happens in the U.S. And the statutes and the statues and the streets named after these key players. Okay, so in Kosovo, in the area that used to be Yugoslavia, you've got streets named after former presidents. You've got statues being erected of former presidents. You've got statues being erected of maybe ineligible presidents. You've got all of this happening, right? These key players have their names all over Kosovo and the area that once was Yugoslavia, where this happened. And 9/11 happens here, the same year that war ends. And the people involved in 9/11 and what happened thereafter, their names are all over that area. Their names are all over that area in streets and statues and squares. So now we're dealing with a statue of Joe B, we'll call him, right? A statue of Joe B is being prepared to be in a place where civil war happened because of the communist playbook I just went over with you that they used to bring the war to that point. That is the same playbook they are attempting to use in this country. I'm going to say it again. So there is a statue being prepared of Joe B, okay, of Mr. Biden, to be in a place, to be unveiled in a place where civil war happened and ethnic cleansing happened and groupthink and all these things happened because of the playbook, the communist global playbook that I just went over with you. The same playbook being used here, just different cover. This man's statue is being put up there. Tell me you can just call him Brandon. Maybe that's a good idea. Maybe we'll use code and say Brandon. Now, there was a dictator at the time in that area, and his name, if you all remember, was Tito. That's another story. But there was a dictator over there at the time, and his name was Tito. This is no coincidence that this is going on. Okay? This is what's going on. This is a prophetic connect the dots. And I happen to like these when the Lord does these with me because it gives you the prophetic, it gives you what's happening, it gives you history and how they all come together. It gives you the spiritual. Okay, so now there's this statue of we'll call him Brandon. Let's go, Brandon. A statue that's being put in that place where the Civil War happened because of a global communist playbook that is now being used here as well. So now you've got this statue of this puppet being prepared and planted in a place where civil war happened for the very things they are attempting to do to this country and the people of this country. You can't make this stuff up. Which brings us back to Saul now. You see, you're going to see how this all lines up. And his monument that he had erected and the kingdom being torn away from him. Okay, when Saul cannot catch David, this was a big game of catch me if you can, of Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, David being the Roadrunner. And this was what this was, okay? Because David's being protected by the Lord. David is being insulated and protected by the Lord, while Saul is trying to catch him and kill him, to stop the word of the Lord of, I'm giving the kingdom to a neighbor that is better than you, Saul, and it's been torn away from you. Saul thinks if he can kill David, he can stop the word of the Lord from coming to pass. This is how far gone Saul was, how much reverence he lost for God, how much mentally he deteriorated, how much spiritually he deteriorated, and how much he became an empty vessel for the enemy to fill. He's trying to kill David to keep this prophecy and this word from coming to its fulfillment and its completion. Saul actually thought if he did that, he was so deceived by the enemy that if he did that, he could hold on to the kingdom. He was desperately trying to hold on to a kingdom that in the spirit God had already ruled was being taken from him. He was just the shell of a leader in the natural. He was nothing more than a shell of a leader in the natural when this happened. That's all Saul was at that point, a prop, a puppet. That's all he was. Somebody else was pulling the strings and it wasn't God. So in the middle of Saul trying to kill David and not being able to kill him because the hand of the Lord is upon David and the Lord is protecting David, Saul makes the brilliant call, must have been one of his advisors that told him to do this, to go to a witch for spiritual counsel, the Witch of Endor. A witch that calls up the dead, and a witch, and by the way, if you want to know the true definition of a witch and what they do, just go look at the word of God and the Witch of Endor. They do spells. They got cauldrons. They call up the dead. They talk to what they think is the dead. Thank you, Grace. They practice witchcraft, black magic. Those sort of horrific, horrible, dark, destructive things that are of the kingdom of darkness. Okay? That's a witch. So Saul, because now Samuel never saw Saul again. So when Saul tore the tallit, and he tore it, when Samuel left Saul that day, and we're going to get into this, he never saw Saul again. He never went to see Saul again. So Saul's top spiritual advisor leaves amidst this scandal that Saul has created in the kingdom now by what he did with the Amalekites, by what he did erecting a monument to himself. His spiritual advisor leaves. So what does he do in desperation? Because remember, Saul gave a decree in the land that anybody practicing witchcraft was to be executed. So Saul started off kind of okay, and then he kind of just went downhill. So he gives this decree, and this witch knows it. So when Saul goes to the Witch of Endor now to call up Samuel and for spiritual counsel, this woman who is concealing the fact she's a witch, but Saul knew somehow she was a witch. We don't even know how that happened. We don't even know how Saul found out this woman was a witch, because she was concealing it because of the orders Saul gave in the kingdom. Anybody practicing witchcraft was to be executed. Okay? So when Saul goes to the Witch of Endor for counsel, to now be his supreme spiritual counsel, he is in a panicked state of desperation because the enemy is frantic, because the enemy knows Saul is going down. And the enemy was not able to use Saul to kill David because God's hand was upon David. So you had a tale of two kings at that moment. You had the king that was anointed to be the leader, and you had the king that was in the position of leadership that was just a prop at that moment, that was just a shell, that was just taking up space. So it's the tale of two kings, okay? So what happens is Saul promises not to kill this witch if she does this. And she calls up what seems to be Samuel, which you get in some really funky stuff right there that I personally am still trying to figure out the hot mess that went on with all of that. Okay. But basically, Samuel tells Saul, when the witch calls up this, does whatever ridiculous, horrible, horrific spell she does, and Samuel comes, that Saul was going to be dead tomorrow. This is what Saul and his sons. Now, you get into an area with this too, where you're wondering, had Jonathan not gone with his father? Because Jonathan was loyal to David. Remember, he helped David escape his father. Had Jonathan not gone with his father to the Witch of Endor and partook in that, would Jonathan have died in battle? That is a really good question to ask yourself. Had Jonathan not gone with his corrupt father to the Witch of Endor and said, no, I will not partake of such things because they are not of the Lord, would Jonathan have died in battle with his father? Because Jonathan knew David was to take the throne. Now, and Jonathan told David, I will serve you. You are to have the throne. So that's another good question to ask yourself. Would he have survived had he not partook of that? Because they sealed the deal by eating the meal the witch prepared after she did the ceremony. So they basically seal this by breaking bread and solidify and ratify what was just done by eating what the witch prepares. Okay. Does any of this sound familiar? Does any of this sound familiar? Because this sounds awfully familiar to me. Okay. And Saul had free will. He had free will. Saul made the decision to become, you see, Saul didn't become corrupt overnight. This was a process of Saul listening to the wrong people who claimed to be believers, who claimed to have his best interest, who claimed to know what they're doing, to claim they knew how to advise on such matters. And Saul listened to the wrong people. And Saul ultimately fell because he wouldn't keep his mouth or his hands off of those God anointed to do such things like David, or for those God anointed to do the task God has given them to carry out. Okay? Saul deteriorated over a period. He got corrupted over a period. Okay? This wasn't something that was overnight. Now, then I decide to say, okay, we found the monument. We have found the parallel. What about the tearing of the fabric, Lord? What about the tearing of the fabric? Well, I did some digging and I find this headline from August of 2021, so just about a month and a half ago. Republicans unironically claim Joe Biden's agenda is tearing the country apart. I'll read it again. Republicans unironically claim Joe Biden's agenda is tearing the country apart. There's the tear. There's the tearing. Because what Saul was doing was tearing the country apart. There were those siding with Saul. There were those siding with David. They're fighting with each other. Saul was just tearing things up and watching it burn. Like, seriously. It was Saul's agenda over God's commands that ended up tearing the kingdom from him. It was Saul's agenda over God's commands that ended up tearing the kingdom from him. And now it's Joe B's agenda over God's commands that will now cause the country to be torn away from him. It's now his agenda. and the agenda of the enemy over God's commands, that will now cause the country to be torn away from him. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 30 through 31. Then he said, I have sinned, yet honor me now, please, before the elders of my people and before Israel, and return with me that I may worship the Lord your God. So Samuel turned back after Saul, and Saul worshiped the Lord. After this, Samuel never went to see Saul again. Listen to Saul's words. I have sinned, but honor me before the elders of my people. Think about that. He says to Samuel, I have sinned, but now come and honor me. Not honor God, not repent before God. Come honor me. And I don't mean me, Saul. Saul is saying to Samuel, come honor me before the elders of my people to still make me look favored of God. To make him look like he's still favored of God when he's not. To make it look like he has a kingdom he doesn't have anymore. This was all an act of subterfuge. It was an illusion. It was a propagation. It was all of it. What religious figure is Joe B set to meet with? So he gives the appearance of having a religious good standing. The Pope reported 4 days ago that he is set to meet with the Pope, and of course will be photographed and televised and everything else to make it look like he has good standing amongst the people. He has good standing amongst the church, to make it look like. So there is the appearance of being godly, of being reverent. So it's the appearance of him being favored and in office he doesn't even have.